about 7 more minutes if you'd like to add anything.
That was really the most that I wanted to get out, was the fact that we really need to be having those dialogues about the future of media. And if everybody could support public television, that would be really wonderful. We try and do the best we can, but as I said, we're having a tough time too. I don't know if you ever watch our Friday night shows, which are our public affairs programs, but there's a lot of wonderful shows that we have on there. And 2 of them, now with David Brancaccio and Maria Hinojosa, and Bill Moyer's Journal, are both leaving public television, which if you watch those shows, they do an amazing job, and they really give voice to the poor, and you hear those stories that you never hear anyplace else. And they're both leaving public television. Now is leaving because of funding issues. They just can't afford it anymore. And Bill Moyers is leaving because he's retiring. And I hope that he doesn't go too far, because I really, just personally, I depend on them a lot for the information that I use to make my decisions about important issues. And not having them there, I think they're going to leave, for me, and I know for a lot of people, it will leave a huge hole. So, interesting times. So pay attention and do what you can. Really.
Thank you very much. We'll move on now to.
Can we ask questions at this point?
We're a little bit behind schedule because the first panel ran about 20 minutes over. So we're going to, I think, hear from all the speakers and then save questions till the very end, just to make sure everybody gets, their time. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. John Rains.
I'm going to ask us to look at the world from the point of view of those who are starving, or near starving. And the truth is, there are many, many more people in the world today who live the world as those who are starving or near starving, and look at reality from that point of view. 2 years ago, a great human tragedy was taking place. In the first 3 months of 2008, the price of rice, wheat, and maize, the subsistent crops of the poor, doubled. In those first 3 months, 100 million people were added to those who were living in absolute poverty, UN $1 a day or less, in 3 months. I want to ask why, and I want to ask what can we do about it. I was told I was going to have 20 minutes. That's 20 minutes. I have to cut it down. I only have 15. So I'll read part of it, but then I'll depart from part of it, from the manuscript part. There is no more severe poverty than the poverty called starving. It's really quite simple. We either eat or we die. Now the plain truth is there's plenty of food in the world to feed all 6.5 billion of us adequately. But the fact is that at least 1 billion, and perhaps close to 2 billion of our fellow humans face each day a desperate insecurity. They are unsure of enough food to keep themselves and their families alive. The poor of the world know what it means to pray for our daily bread. I intend to examine this kind of poverty called starvation and ask and answer the question, why is this happening? Once I have named the problem, I will offer some suggestions as to its solution. It will help us get into this discussion if we pull back, so to speak, our thinking about food, because when you're talking about starvation, you're thinking about food. 95% of the time this species of ours have been on planet Earth, we did our food work as hunters and gatherers. 95% of the time, we did our food work as hunters and gatherers. Food was done, so to speak, under your feet. Only 10,000 years ago, did we begin to do agriculture. Our ancient ancestors discovered wheat in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. And then they discovered a very important tool called the water system, irrigation. Irrigation made it possible for food to be relatively dependable. And food that was relatively dependable was the precondition of people gathering together in intense populations, dense populations. Before that, that would mean starvation. The city became possible. What happened in the city is because of the tremendous population, the density of that population, the division of labor necessarily rapidly expanded. It had to. You had to get out of each other's way. You get out of each other's way, you specialized. So your work became more and more specialized, and more things became possible. One of the things that was becoming more and more specialized was the work called knowledge. Knowledge became more specialized. Written language appeared. Tribal customs began to become written laws that insisted upon former tribal strangers becoming dependable neighbors. Belonging took on a new meaning because the way we did our food work was changing. Food has been the great work of our species. If you think about it, in the past, but also still today, more people are engaged in the work of food than any other single work. Planting, cultivating, harvesting, transporting it, marketing it, buying it, preparing it, serving it. Food remains the great work of our species. And a good way of understanding our species and how it's changing and how we are changing is to look at our dwelling on planet Earth through the lens of how we do the work called food. Food for hunters and gatherers and for pre-industrial agriculture was about the ground under their feet. It was local and it was seasonal. But today, food has taken to the air and to the roads. It has become a kind of immaterial abstraction, something wrapped in plastic on supermarket shelves, and we don't know where it came from, and we don't know how it was produced. What is the meaning of this new way we privileged folks of the world do our food work when we want to understand ourselves through looking through the lens of how we do our food work? Here's a haiku worth thinking about. Time conquers space, and a sense of place gets erased. So they go. Time conquers space, and the sense of place gets erased. It used to take a lot of time to travel across significant space. We humans were, for most of our evolutionary history, a space-confined species. But no longer. Now trade in food is guided by capital investment flows that surge around the world at the speed of a computer's entry key. Food work has become global, and the logic of that work is no longer the logic of human hunger, but the hunger of global food corporations for profits. And it is right here that we find the key to the modern tragedy called starvation. If you remember nothing else from what I say, think about what I'm just going to say. Food follows money. Food follows money. And poor people don't have a lot of money and are therefore unprofitable sites for corporate investment. This was something unforeseen by the idealists at the Rockefeller Foundation, who beginning in the 1950s funded research on genetic manipulation of various seeds, especially the seeds of subsistence crops like rice and wheat and maize. It was to be a green revolution that would, quote, end world hunger, and indeed, they were miracle seeds, producing miracles both planned but also unplanned. The stem on rice, for example, was engineered for greater strength, which could support a far more substantial fluorescence. Then, by adding fertilizer and pesticides, it became possible to reap 3 harvests a year instead of 2. It did seem like the end of hunger for the millions of the poor who ate rice in order not to die. But there was a problem. Fertilizers, pesticides, cost money. And the new seeds were produced and patented by corporations. And that cost money. All that became a source of corporate profit. But small rice farmers could not afford the seeds, could not afford the fertilizer, could not afford the pesticides. So they had to sell their farm and become seasonal day laborers on giant absentee-owned, often corporate-owned farms. Or they joined the largest migration in human history, going on today. Rural folks moving to the city looking for money. There's an example of that from right next door, 200 miles away. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, opened the borders between Mexico and the USA. Our federally supported corn grown on giant monoculture farms flooded the Mexican market with cheap corn. The result was that indigenous corn growers in Mexico were forced out of the market. They sold or abandoned their farms and traveled north looking for work in the factories along the northern border, or unwilling to work for the $100 a week that was offered there, they kept on going north and became undocumented workers in the United States of America. Here is the irony of that fence we built along our southern border. It lets our corn go south unhindered, but it tries to stop humans fleeing in the opposite direction from the disaster our corn caused with its Mexican journey. But hope, those folks still eat, don't they? Isn't starvation mostly confined to the global south and Africa or Southeast Asia? Okay, let us travel against time and recover some of the space and the sense of place that corporate investment policies simply left behind. Why was it in those first 3 months of 2008, why was it that 100 million people were added to the 800 million people already living in absolute poverty? 100 million is a hard figure to get your head around. Perhaps in the tragedy of Haiti, we may find that 50,000 people have died in that tragedy. Multiply that by 2 and add 3 zeros. That's 100 million. Why was that 100 million added in just 3 months? In fact, it may be a gross undercount, because the poor, the really poor, have to spend between 60 and 80% of the financial resources they have available to their family, 60 to 80% on food. And if your food doubles, you can imagine what that does to your family budget when you're having to spend 60 to 80%. So perhaps we've got to get stopping the documentation. Take for granted that I've got it right on the terrible problem of starvation. So, how do we stop this? How can we discipline capital investments to a higher moral end than the private accumulation of wealth by a tiny minority? Money that invests in nothing else but making money. That is what has become capitalism today. We used to think that you made money by making things that others would buy. Food, factories, workers, jobs. Not today. 90% of financial transaction, of international financial transaction, has nothing to do with investing in production. It has become a global casino. Wall Street has become Las Vegas without borders.